Welcome everybody to today's Real Training for Free session. Nick Cavalencia here sitting in for Randy Franklin Smith. Glad you're all joining me today. This is a really good topic, and I'm glad we're touching on it. The idea of AD tech debt, meaning the things that are sort of remnants from the last 20 years of, let's be honest, you not entirely or someone not entirely managing AD and keeping it completely clean, means that there's going to be ramifications as you're shifting, I'm assuming already, into a hybrid environment and eventually into a completely cloud environment perhaps. And the idea here is to try and figure out what that tech debt looks like, what do you do about it, and then securing the path as you're trying to modernize your environment to be probably mostly cloud, maybe a little on-prem, maybe getting to where there's no on-prem. It's absolutely fine. We want to try to get the tech debt out of the way and make you aware of it as much as we possibly can. Now, today's Real Training for Free session is brought to you by the good folks at Silver Fort. And we do have two speakers we're going to hear a little bit later from. A little later on, we're going to hear from Dor Segal. He's the security research team lead from Silver Fort. And Dor is going to do a bit of a demonstration to demonstrate how Silver Fort can help with some of this tech debt issues that we're going to be talking about today. Dor, thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be here, Nick.
Glad you're here. And up first that you're going to hear just after I do a bit of an introduction here from Stephen Rennick. And Stephen is the Identity and Access Management Architect from Sienna, a partner of Silver Fort's. And Stephen, I'm glad that you're here as well. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to join.
Awesome. Now, before we do get started, as always, just a couple of brief housekeeping items we're going to go through. The first one being that today's Real Training for Free session is being recorded. If for some reason you need to leave early or you want to share this with a colleague or whatnot, you will be receiving a copy of the recording, a link to it in an email in a couple of days. So be on the lookout for that. If you need that, you'll of course be able to get that recording without a problem. The other thing here is, as always, we are taking questions throughout the presentation. I'm a big believer in answering questions in context if we can. So I do have the Q&A box open here in front of me. We may even ask you guys a couple of questions throughout if you've never been on one of these webinars before. I'm thinking most of you have, but it may be something Stephen and I or Dor and I are talking about, and maybe we want to ask you a question real quick to see whether or not you're having these problems. So we'll just use the Q&A box as both our way of chatting with one another, and at the same time, feel free to ask any questions that you might have as we walk through the presentation today. I'm going to jump first here in and just sort of level set the idea around the presence of AD tech debt. How prevalent is it? Is it really something you have to concern yourself with? Obviously, we're doing a webinar on it, so I think you're going to know the answer, but we can talk about it and try to paint a picture for you, to try to give you the idea around how that's going to have ramifications into a hybrid identity-driven environment, and then how that maps a little bit to MITRE, just so you can see where MITRE comes into play and what tactics are impacted by AD tech debt, and then where some of the commodity controls do help and where they largely don't. And Stephen, while I'm doing my presentation, I may have a couple questions for you if it's okay, or you might even have some commentary on some of the things I'm doing in my presentation, and I would love to just engage in a bit of a discussion. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, awesome. So we're going to jump in here, and I made a very, very simple slide, and it's where does AD tech debt come from? This is the entire slide. I just sort of thought it was funny because I'm like, that's it. That's the reason. It's right there. 20 years of basically, you think about every AD environment that exists today, whether I'm going to guess that, most of you have dealt with, let's say, some portion of the last 25 years of having AD. So, matter of fact, I'm going to ask this while I'm covering the rest of this slide. If you'd put in the Q&A box how long you have managed the AD that you're at right now, if it's a really big, now if it's like 2 years, okay, this is like when you go on a cruise and they say who's been married the longest, and that's what we're trying to figure, who's been managing it. So Charlie already says 25 years. Charlie already wins, but I just wondering how long you guys all have been managing your AD. And I think of an AD environment, of course, as being just sort of full of an accumulation of changes over time. And unless your organization has been very, very diligent in change management and keeping track of everything that's been done, you've been doing things like attestation of group membership and worried about nesting and doing periodic reviews and all that, it's probably more like an amalgamation of 20 years of one-off fixes to, and I think this is appropriate, daily problems that no one even remembers anymore. And so, and I see some other people here. I got another 25 years from Ian. Rose says 17 years. Mark says since 2000. I'm going to murder your name. Horatio. I hope I said that right. Maybe that's your last name because I see David your first name, maybe, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's David. 12 years. Marcus 25 years. Fred says since Windows 3.11 came out, wasn't out quite then. When Windows and Windows for Workgroups 3.1 were out, NT 3.1 was out, and then NT 3.5, 3.5.1, and then 4.0. So it's been a while though, Fred. So maybe your memory's not as good as today, but it's okay. And Douglas says, I've been at this since Novell. Same here. My first server was a NetWare 2.2 server running on a 286 in non-dedicated mode. And Tim says 18 years. So we got a bunch of folks here that have been doing this a long time. And I see there's a lot more of you that haven't even answered. That's okay, you don't have to, but it's a lot less years. So the reason why I asked that question was there's 25 years, and even these folks that have been doing this for a very long time, they certainly don't remember every change, neither do the rest of you. Stephen, do you agree? This is just sort of 25 years of sprawl. It's acquisitions, setting up trust between domains, forgetting about stuff that you made changes from 3 years ago. Is that really the problem?
I completely agree, and I think there are different levels of governance that come along during those 25 years. I think there are, perhaps in most cases, many different administrators coming through that do things in their own special ways, and what worked 20 years ago doesn't work now, and things have changed over time, and they do change over time, and they evolve and they adapt. But what we rarely do is go back and clean up the tech debt, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, I think is the notion more often than not. And it's really difficult. Active Directory sprawl is a really good way of talking about it here, because it is just sprawl, and it's nearly impossible to get a grasp on everything if you don't have an army of people looking at all those details throughout time. So all the things you mentioned, I completely agree with. I was going to mention the acquisition, because that's a big one too. You inheriting someone else's mess. And then getting into things like, well, some people use group policy a certain way. Some people use organizational units a certain way. Not everybody has a clearly defined and automated group creation process. So those are done in an ad hoc fashion. Same for users, non-human users too. So definitely agree with this. It's a challenge that we're going to get into the guts of today.
Yeah, when I used to have an IT consulting company, and I focused mostly on large organizations, like back in the day in the AD, where there's no cloud yet, I did like the AD designs and exchange designs for like the Chicago Tribune and the Fox News and Carnival Cruise Lines and Hummer and a whole bunch of other organizations. And one of the things that I always found, to your point, about like the group policies being used in different ways, no two organizations ever did everything the same way, just didn't. And so I think that becomes also part of the problem, because even when I go to some of these answers that I have in front of me that are not 25 years, although Mick actually gave us his AD user creation date, which I think he looked up just for this webcast today when I asked, but he says July 9th, 2001. So Mick's being very specific. But there are even somebody that said 17 years, 18 years, 12 years, 15 years, and so on. The people that came before you, and those of you that didn't answer, who the numbers are even much smaller than that. You don't know what those people did, and there's probably not necessarily an exchanging of hands of processes, procedures, standards, and so on. And there's it's funny, even you mentioned kind of, Stephen, how we did things 20 years ago is not how we do them today. Now we want to talk about change management. We want to restrict access. Security is a huge concern. Back then, we didn't care about security except for don't give everyone admin rights, that kind of thing. So so it makes a lot of sense here. So let's dive in a little bit. And I want to talk about 7 kinds of AD tech debt. This by no means is an exhaustive list. But Steve, I thought maybe we just go through and go through each one of these, which are not on the screen yet for those of you that are just watching, and we just talk about them each a little bit and just back and forth a little bit, if that's okay. The first one is just the idea of over permissioned users. And I'm thinking about things like, one, the fact that, of course, and I never understood this. I do understand it, but I thought that eventually Microsoft will fix this. None of the permissions are in Active Directory. At least it's not documented in Active Directory. I thought that'd be a great way to, anytime you'd go into some, like you go and give someone like rights to a database or a table or something in SQL, it would somehow get like documented in user accounts. You could go to a user and see everywhere they have permissions. And of course they don't. So it's always set it, forget it. If you just did a delegation of rights to an OU, once you go through the little next finish wizard they have, I don't know what I assigned. I have no clue. It's gone, and I'd have to go back and look for it. And then you also have things like repurposing of groups over time. Over 20 years, a group may be repurposed for a different need. And at the same time, not really worried about the membership of that group and whether or not somebody who used to be in the group when it was used for this particular purpose should actually still be in that group because now it's used for that particular purpose. And then things like nesting have been there, also add some complexity. What have you seen, Steve, that kind of adds to the idea of over permissioning users?
Well, I think right from the beginning of time, we saw the idea of people just giving domain admin access or highly privileged access just because it's easier, right? It's the easy path. Don't know what permission it needs. Let's give it as much as we possibly can, and then it'll work, right? So I think that's a big one for me. And you touched base on the group side, and everything you said is 100% correct. We see it in every environment that I've ever looked in. But I also think it's this idea of not just the repurposing of groups, but the idea of like, well, we already have a group that has those people in it. We don't want to create a new group, so let's just use that same group. And nomenclature never gets updated, the description never gets updated. Rarely does the ownership ever get updated, and ownership will change many times over that course of time. So all are recipes for problems down the road. So yeah, I think you hit on a lot of them.
Your note about making everybody admin has me laughing, because I remember years ago, this is in like the 90s when compliance mandates were first coming out, like HIPAA and high tech, and it was some little bits that had to do with IT, but not like we have today, where we actually have data governance and data privacy laws and all kinds of stuff. And I remember reading, I can't remember what standard this was from, but it said, and I quote, this one of the requirements was establish and maintain levels of security. And I was like, okay, cool. Everyone's an admin. Checkbox. I did. I established and I maintained levels of security. Everyone's an admin. That's it. I'm done. And I just thought how silly that is.
Historically, just another point on that, Nick. I think historically, applications have been guilty of this too, right? And I mean external applications. So you buy a product and you want to enroll it in your environment, and in their documentation, it just says that you need to be domain admin, right?
Oh, yeah. They didn't done the work.
The blame has to be shifted a little bit there too, right? I think we're much better now because permissions are able to be assigned in a more granular fashion. But in the legacy days, which is what we're talking about today, that was the normal thing. Yep, it just needs this permission, and it's just a wide, broad range of permission, and so that's what we gave it because that's what they were asking for.
Yeah, David says applications from third-party service user accounts. He was writing this at the same time you were saying it. Yep. Applications from third-party service user accounts just made domain admins to make them work. Just like it's almost lazy in some ways.
It's completely lazy. Yep.
Mark says this burns my ears hearing us say make everyone admin. Sorry, Mark, I just made your ears burn again. And then Troy mentioned here that with job role changes and movers, the process just doesn't exist to double check, to your point of like someone's in a group, if we move them to another role in the organization, they should be taken out of the group. That just doesn't exist in a lot of cases. So I think these, Mark calls those crapplications, the ones where they don't give you the correct rights that you actually need to run. So let's keep going. Next one I've got is I'm thinking about even endpoint security, and thinking about how group policy can be used. You talked about it maybe being used different ways. Some people like to definitely push out the endpoint policies that way. And I was just thinking of like something as simple as the log on locally policy. And you could push that out and give someone log on locally rights, or give an account or a group log on locally rights, and the repercussions therein if you're not paying attention to which organizational units have that group policy being applied to it. And that ends up, especially then if we take things like we add that on to the idea of the acquisitions, multiple domains, trusts involved, where are the endpoints actually, which domain are those actually in versus which account which domain, excuse me, is the user account actually in. And you can see it's this, it just gets very, very convoluted. Thoughts, Stephen?
Yeah, I think this is a big one too, related to local admin privileges on endpoints, right? If you're not solving for that in some way, there's a lot of devious things that can happen, including creating or spawning other local accounts, which then become really challenging to manage if you don't have an enterprise endpoint management solution. So yeah, I think this one's a big one.
I had that as my third, but it's okay. They kind of tie together. But I was even thinking for something like the local admin privileges. Here's just a simple example. If you're not careful where it's granted, you could end up having an account that has local login locally rights to a server that's acting as a DC. And so now that means they have, in essence, let's call it logically physical access. I don't know if that even makes any sense, but you get what I mean. It might be a VM, but they have like physical access to the database now, and can go grab the database and then try to hack it and get into Active Directory. So there's lots of things that can happen here. Next one I've got is I'm calling it just sort of unsanctioned admin access. And I'm just thinking about the idea around, back to the idea of the acquisitions. There's this conglomerate of domains across trusts, and there's got to be some likely resulting access, because much like the idea of oh, we have a group that already has the rights to do X, let's just give it the other rights that it needs, because they're now got a different thing we're going to do with that same group that feels very much the same, feeling like, oh, you're domain admins, I have domain admins, that's the same thing, let's just put them all in enterprise admins, and that's good. Well, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. Who's in their admins group? And we're not looking at memberships necessarily, but what have you seen around unsanctioned admin access at a much higher level than just even an endpoint?
Yeah, I think the notion, you touched on it, the notion of excessive trust, right? When those relationships get established through an acquisition or something of the like, often there's really broad actions or broad permissions that are set for similar reasons to what we were describing with the applications. Like, we don't know what it's going to need, so rather than have to fight through that, let's just give it as much access as we can, or much trust as we can, and everything will just work, right? And we never go back and really try to pare that down or leverage the notion of zero trust to try and make sure that we're only giving the permissions that are required in those cases. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I remember in a former life, even before I had IT consulting, I was a Microsoft certified trainer. I was an MCT, teaching folks how to become MCSEs and all that. My MCP number is 5 digits, so that gives you any notion of how long it's been. But I remember talking about there's this balance between productivity and security. And it was pretty much at that point, it wasn't like today where we're talking about like least privilege or zero trust, or it was more like just, are you an admin on the local machine, or are you a user? And that was very, very stark and very simple delineations that exist. And obviously that doesn't exist today. We would much rather have, okay, you can log onto a server, but you only have rights to manage DNS on that server. That's what we'd rather have if that was even possible. And I think I've even tried to do that in previous lives. But I completely agree here with you. It's far more convoluted now. Let's talk about potential misuse of well-known users and groups. So we have domain users, we have domain admins. This is probably, Stephen, it feels to me kind of like an offshoot of the previous bullet of unsanctioned admin access in a lot of ways, or unsanctioned access.
Yeah, I think over time, those well-known groups and users were exploited because they had excessive permissions, right? When you think about print operators, for example, there's one that got exploited pretty regularly, right? And we didn't think it was a big deal to have someone as part of print operators, but we know that printers are typically wide open and have default credentials on them, and so that's a vulnerability side that's well known. And I was going to talk about the unsanctioned admin access, and so I'm glad these two points are together. We have a tendency just to gloss over and say, well, are they in domain admins? Okay, great, we've got that one locked down, awesome. But think of the notion of an acquisition where they had governance around those things, but what do we do when there's a gate in the middle of the road and it's difficult for us to get through the gate? We go around the gate,
leave it open.
We end up creating these groups that have permissions that aren't obvious to us. And so when we look at it from a governance perspective and we say, you shouldn't have everybody in domain admins, well, what happens when someone creates a group that has similar permissions, but it's named something completely different? Do those get caught? Do you have a mechanism to catch those, to govern those in an effective way, or do they just become shadow admins? So I think it's a combination of both. The misuse of well-known users and groups is bad enough, but it becomes an incredible challenge to deal with the other types of groups that I mentioned.
David mentioned something that goes, man, this is like a turn in the Wayback Machine. This is like really going back, but he mentions pre-Windows 2000 compatibility groups with anonymous as member,
Yeah. Wildcards, anonymous, yeah, there's
interactive, network, all that. Yeah, I remember all that. It's good stuff. This next bullet is just, I think, and the same as the previous bullet, just with the addition of across trusts. And now we have this idea of we're coexisting between multiple AD environments that now have to work together if there are trusts. And so I feel like it's the same kind of thing. I'm assuming you would completely agree, and we don't have to beat this to a dead horse, but I think it's the same across trust. It only exacerbates even farther your point about company A having some very strict policies or whatever, but company B that acquires them doesn't have those same policies. You didn't use A and B, but that's the way I'm thinking about it. And so
B could be as simple as subdomains too, right? Right.
Sorry.
The idea of a subdomain or another forest, anything like that, right? So if you're if you have an audit on one, does the audit cover all? That's a very real possibility too. The unknown, right?
Yeah. Definitely. And then the last thing here, this still involves trust, but this is like security remnants from prior migrations. I'm thinking about SID history. SID history, it remains. There's a potential there for attack. One, if a particular SID history entry happens to reference, let's say, a well-known used group, that's fine. But then there's also just if SID history is supported still post-migration, that someone can use a well-known SID and try to hack in that way. So that it's not just the remnants, but it's the supporting of remnants, I guess, is the way I'm looking at that. Stephen, thoughts?
Yeah, this is a big one related to life cycle as well, right? Prior migrations or application decommissioning, things of that nature, right? How often are you tied together and have it really well documented that when I'm decommissioning or sunsetting an application, I'm going to go back and make sure that all the accounts that were created and associated with that are gone too, right? It's pretty rare that it happened in the old days, and I'd even argue in Active Directory now. It's a challenge, right? It's difficult to pull all those things together if you don't have something like a CMDB and one that's current and active and well designed and used. So you're going to see those types of remnants from historical applications being decommissioned.
Yeah, I'd agree here. So so let's kind of talk about moving forward for all you that are listening. I think we've covered those. The problem here, of course, is if you're going hybrid, and I'm assuming you've already gone hybrid at this point. Everybody has, but if you're going hybrid, doing so in general, whether you've done it already or you're planning on it, it's going to exacerbate the problem. You think about whether using Azure AD Sync or now, of course, Entra Connect Sync. You have a federated identity of some kind where it supports Active Directory as an identity store and so on. You're exacerbating. You're taking all the old garbage and you're simply expanding it and throwing it out into the cloud, into these federated types of services, or into, in the case of Microsoft's Entra ID, another platform that's there to, by definition, sync with on-prem AD. And that becomes the problem here with all these remnants that are coming into play. The fact that you have these elevated accounts, the group memberships that are wrong, you have the policies that are incorrect if they happen to be something that syncs up, and so on. I mean, the thoughts, Stephen, here about what you've seen, maybe perhaps where someone had garbage, they went hybrid, and they have now cloudy garbage, if you will.
Yeah, I think if you go back to the beginning, it all started when Microsoft aptly named Azure Active Directory when it really wasn't a replacement for Active Directory, and that got everybody excited. And how do we move everything to the new Active Directory and get rid of the old one? It created a lot of problems. Now, I mean, Microsoft does go through and rename things all the time, and I think most of us as practitioners and administrators are frustrated with that, but that was a really bad move on their part. So I think that opened the door for folks to just say, oh, well, I want to get rid of this, so I'm going to sync everything that I had on my on-prem to my cloud. And that's poor practice, right? There are lots of accounts that exist in your environment that you will never need in your hybrid environment, or at least in your cloud side. So only sync what you need, right? That's probably best practice. And then, like you mentioned, it's not just the configuration on the AD side that's the problem, it's the configuration on the other side, right? What default permissions, what default resource allocations, what default policies are in place on the other side that these resources are going to now have access to. So if you've got an old Active Directory service or shared account that hasn't had a password changed in 10 years, and you synchronize it into Entra, and it has permissions to resources and actionability in that environment, well, you've just created a great lateral movement area for your threat actors. So lots of examples we could give here, but those are the ones that come up to the top of my head.
And speaking of lateral movement, I love when you do my segues for me, Stephen. Thank you. This is obviously going to enable a lateral movement on-prem already. That's what we're normally thinking about. Typically, we're thinking about lateral movement, but there's a shift to hybrid. We actually did a webinar, I don't remember how long ago, I'm going to say it's like at least 6 months ago, here at Ultimate IT Security, where someone walked through and showed lateral movement. They jumped from cloud platform to cloud platform, and the same thing is possible. It's certainly a lot easier when it's just like a Windows environment to another Windows environment, as opposed to jumping from one cloud provider to another. But if you've got some kind of federated identity, it's certainly enabled here. And this is just the problem is that the risk exposure is so much greater. You hit it on the head, Stephen. This idea of like some account that should have never been synced in the first place gets synced. That's a risk if it's got access to something. If it's in a group that also got migrated up, and everyone's forgotten about the account that's in that group that now has access to something in the cloud, it just increases the risk exposure here. So a couple of comments did come in here. Cal says, I'm shocked that end of life didn't make the tech debt list. I think we're talking about the root causes, not so much end of life of something, but and certainly end of life of even some of the Microsoft platforms and even Active Directory and its various iterations. But Troy asked,
realistically, though, a point on the tech debt list. I mean, I think there were 7 items there. That could easily have been 700, right? We just didn't want to bore you with slideware today, so we tried to narrow it down. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more.
Yeah, for timing, I would agree. I'm trying to be done in about 2 minutes so that you have upwards of an hour between you and Dor to go through everything you need here. Troy says, how do you track multiple accounts that are assigned to users? For example, it's a bit longer. An IT server admin could or will have a normal day-to-day account, a tier 0 elevated account, and maybe a tier 0 or 1 cloud-only account. What's used as the identity hub source of truth for account management? And then mentions ideally service accounts they're using managed groups or Azure managed identities. If not, the manager field is populated with an owner and manages it in PAM or something as some other type of solution here. When you're trying to track multiple accounts assigned to a user, is that a problem you deal with a lot, or how are you normally recommending to your clients that you handle something like that, where there's a day-to-day, a tier 0, a tier 1/0 for cloud, etc.?
Yeah, I think from a lifecycle perspective, it's a great point. It's not typically solved for within the directory itself. It's usually a function of identity governance, traditionally, right? So we would have an identity governance solution that would see all of your various IDPs and source of identity in your environment and bring them into one centralized location. Now, when I say identities, I mean human identities. They weren't great at non-human identities, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But for human identities, and consider administration accounts or test accounts, things like that, typically what they would do is create kind of like an identity cube or some way of correlating those accounts. And then when you had a lifecycle event, i.e. your system of truth source of record says that Nick is no longer with the company, what accounts does Nick have assigned to him?
What?
And those should be decommissioned. Yeah. Nick won the lottery.
It's even better. I like that. I used to see you get hit by a bus. I'm like, that's really a bad one. I don't want you to get hit by a bus. Okay, yeah, you win the lottery. It's a lot better.
I don't want to go too far off, but I think what's happening now is we're starting to see a convergence, because IGA programs are typically programs that take a very long time to bear fruit, right? It's in some cases it can be, you know, a 3 to 5 year program just to get it implemented and have everything integrated in your environment. So, you know, not super fast, and that's a challenge for a lot of folks. And I think what we're doing in a more modern state is we're doing things now. There's a Gartner coined a new phrase, a new acronym called IVIP. Identity visibility, and what's the other I? I'm gapping on it right now, but they call it a platform, and I don't really like the idea. Oh, intelligence. Sorry. Yeah,
intelligence. Yeah,
visibility and intelligence.
Identity visibility and intelligence platforms.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and so the notion there is like all account types would come into a centralized location, and you'd be able to do that correlation there without having to go through the heavy lifting of an entire IGA program. So look out for that if you have not implemented something like that to this point. Just wanted to kind of give you guys a heads up that that's an area that's hopeful to focus on.
Awesome. I've got 2 more slides. I'm going to hand things over to you in a second here, Stephen. I always like to tie things back to MITRE as much as I can. I know you all have seen on if you've been on my webinars before here, I try to do this just because it's a really good framework. That's everything we're talking about always aligns back to this is what the bad guys are doing, and this is what you should be doing to either detect or mitigate and so on. And if you're not familiar with the MITRE attack framework, go to attack, spelled like the word attack, even though it's written the way it's written there on the left. It's attack.mitre.org, and MITRE, you can see how it's spelled there on the left. And I went and grabbed just a couple of different types of techniques that would take advantage of AD tech debt. And what I'd like you to do is, rather than us going through all these, you know, I'll pull one just to make an example, like right in the middle in privilege escalation. The first one down says access token manipulation. And that would actually be an example of like using SID history. And you'd be modifying the access token to include some SID history, inject something in there, make it a known SID for a domain admin in another domain or something along those lines. And bam, privilege escalation. I mean, it's not that easy, but that's kind of the idea. I want you to focus on the tactics that are possible just from the tech debt, and this doesn't include the repercussions, the ripple effect of, and then they can do all this other stuff because they have, let's say, now have elevated permissions or something. This is just the things dealing with tech debt. You can see initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, discovery, all just from tech debt. And I brought this up, if nothing more to go, this is why you have to pay attention to it. If we didn't get your attention beforehand, hopefully this does, and you go, look, bad guys can do these kinds of things. There's a couple of examples, all because of just AD tech debt. Stephen, anything to add on to this, or thoughts before I go to my last slide?
Yeah, this is a long list, and it makes my brain hurt, and it probably should make everyone's brain hurt that there are this many potential vulnerabilities or parts that can be exploited in AD related to tech debt. So always good to map.
6 months it gets updated, and it's going to get updated this month again. So, and then the last thing here is just thinking about commodity tools, because there are tools that are supposed to help. And so I've just put 3 up here, just really simple. Got MFA, perfect. Put MFA in front of human identities, a lot easier than a non-human identity, of course. Identity access management, maybe even something that's helping with some zero trust and verifying the usage of accounts and things like that could come into play. A PAM solution of some kind, maybe even some kind of session management, a PSM solution as well. I mean, there's lots of kinds of solutions here, but the way I see this, and Stephen, I would love to get your input. I see these as being tools for what I'm going to call current use, meaning we know what these accounts are used for today, and these accounts mean the ones that we know about. These are the admin ones, those are the user accounts, these are the groups we know about, because I don't remember what we did 17 years ago. And so the problem here is that the sprawl that exists, these tools don't necessarily provide coverage. If no one knows that user account over there, Bob Smith, has admin rights to that server over there because it was done 12 years ago, just no MFA on that account necessarily. And so MFA doesn't provide any coverage for the nastiness of the sprawl. What's your thought just sort of on my premise here, Stephen?
Yeah, I like it. I think far too often we get hung up in the idea of these are the things we need to do, like vaulting passwords. you know, and putting MFA on things. And we know that that doesn't work with machine identities and service accounts, even shared accounts. It's a challenge. And if you do make it work in some way, you're probably breaking some sort of policy or governance idea that you would, you know, that you would have. And I think the other point that I want to make here is many of these controls, with the exception of MFA, obviously, are done at admin time. Right, so you're provisioning something, or you're vaulting a password. It's not happening while the bad things are happening. So, like the instance of governance, right, where you're doing periodic reviews and removing the permissions that someone has because they're not using it anymore, or they shouldn't have it. Well, how long have they had the permission that they shouldn't have had, right? And how often is the periodic review versus something that's moving more at the speed of runtime, right? I'm doing something right now. I have context that says I shouldn't be doing it. So let's take action on that. And I know we're going to get into that with Silverfort because it is a great solution for taking action on things. So, you know, I'd include things like ITDR because it's a little more modern, but that's where you're getting to the point where now I have something that I can action based on context or things that I'm seeing in my environment versus it's too late and, you know, I've discovered that somebody did a bad thing, you know, a week ago or 2 days ago, and now somebody's looking through logs and found it. It's too late at that point.
Like that a lot. So I'm going to hand the reins over to Stephen, and he's going to kind of cover this in maybe a little more of a practical way than just we've talked about this kind of more in concept. And I really appreciate all of you for all of your questions and your comments. We love an engaged audience as best we can. So with that, Stephen, I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter, and I'll let you know when I can see your screen. And while we're doing that, everyone, remember, as you have questions, I have the Q&A box up here, and we'll be happy to interject those questions. So Stephen, know that I may be, you know, throwing a question your way or something from the audience mid presentation, but I see breaking free from AD Tech Debt, and it's a Silverfort black and gold slide. As long as that's yours, you're all set. The floor is yours.
That's the one. Yep. Thanks. I'm not going to bore you by reading through most of the slides, and we'll try to go relatively slow through these. I have a tendency to talk fast, so if I'm going too fast, Bob, please, or Nick, sorry, please just give me a nudge and tell me to slow down.
No worries. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm not going to go through this. A little bit about me. I've done lots of stuff related to IT, probably almost 30 years now, everything from desktop support to compute, storage, virtualization, data center management, disaster recovery, backups, networking. I just put my hand up for basically everything over my tenure and tried to learn a lot about all of it. And one thing that's been common across all of those silos is that identity touches every single one. And so I guess it was probably maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I took a focus on identity, and I've really been trying to move my company forward in terms of adapting to the principle of least privilege and championing some zero trust architectures. But I have a keen interest in non-human identities, which I don't even really like the name of, but we'll talk a little bit about that today, and then separating things out between authentication and authorization. So an analogy that we hear often is Active Directory is like a dorm room. It's messy, it's cluttered, it's unorganized. The non-human identities, service accounts, shared accounts, they're everywhere, and they make attacker's job easy. All the things that we discussed previously in Nick's slides, they're all applicable here, but we'll probably drill into some use cases. Not an exhaustive list, so those of you that are going to write in the chat and say, well, you missed this, you know, there's lots that could be in here. It's kind of an overview, but we'll start at the top with the dormant service accounts, right? How do you know that something's dormant? If you're expecting an owner to come back to you and say, yeah, we just don't need this account anymore, well, that doesn't happen very often, right? So you need a mechanism or some way to prove with a reasonable level of doubt that something is dormant or unused in your environment. We talked a little bit earlier about the idea of long-lived secrets, but these are the things where an account has been around a long time and no one knows where it's logging into, and they don't want to change the password despite it being, you know, non-compliant, and it just gets into this quagmire of issues related to compliancy and you know, people just not wanting to do the heavy lifting to really do that discovery, and again tied to the idea of ownership. There's the notion of misused accounts. This is the idea that you have a service account that's logging on interactively, for example, or a shared account that is being used as administrative, or on the flip side of that, a human account that's being used as a service account. Probably those of us that have been around a long time have known many folks in your environments to use their own accounts in scripts in other areas that would be better designed for a service account. They leave the company, the account gets disabled because you do have life cycle related to your workforce identities, and things break. So those are examples of what we would see related to misused accounts. And then the idea of no system of record or source of truth for those non-human identities. It's not like workforce where you have a work day or something where, hey, today's your first day, I'm receiving this information and I'm going to provision an identity related to that. These are ad hoc for the most part, right? Unless you have a really mature IAM program where you are saying, if a service account is to be created, it must go through this process. It could be ServiceNow or an ITSM, something like that. But there's structure to it. There are things that, attributes that must be used, and you can't create them ad hoc in environments. Because there's no system of record or source of truth for these types of identities, they become really hard to manage in terms of both creation and life cycle. There's also the notion of overprivileged access, and we talked a lot about that in the first little bit with Nick, and that's this idea of it needs domain admin. Why does it need domain admin? Or you know, we over provision things just because we don't want to go through the hard work of figuring out what permission it really needs, right down to a resource level, right? It could be saying, well, it needs to be an administrator on this server. Well, why does it need to be an administrator? Could it be something less? So the notion of least privilege should stand. But it rarely does. Excessive IAM trust roles. This is more related to federation and domain trusts. There are all kinds of different things that happen in those types of environments that are often overlooked and never corrected, right? And it's the same idea. We're going to give broad permissions to things because we don't know exactly what it should have. Broad specifications, like these types of groups should just have this permission to an entire forest and not, you know, just a specific domain. So we see a lot of that when we get into mergers and acquisitions and consolidation of environments, maybe even within your own company, right? So historically, if you're an R&D or an engineering shop, you may have had environments that were separate. You kept your enterprise identity and Active Directory separate from your engineering and R&D because there are different requirements. But eventually you want those to come together because it makes sense to do so. You create a trust, and you know, maybe the housekeeping on one side wasn't as good as the other, or maybe there wasn't housekeeping on the other side. So that's kind of what we're talking about there. And I've touched on the lack of ownership previously. This is a really difficult one to manage within Active Directory. It's problematic because as soon as you need to take action on anything that's not a human account, it's really difficult to figure out who that owner is and keep it and maintain it as an updated state. People move roles, they change jobs, they leave the company. And rarely do they go in and say, oh yeah, I'm the owner of 50 service accounts, so make sure that you go in and change my ownership there before I move on to my new cushy job. It rarely happens, and no one typically looks at that and says that it's an important attribute, but it's probably one of the most important attributes that you'll maintain in your Active Directory environment. And then finally, the last one is unrotated keys. And for Active Directory, I'd say this is, you know, good practice related to like current TGG. That's a big one where we've learned over time that it's not okay to just keep that same token going for a long time. It helps us to mitigate things like golden ticket attacks. It aligns with best practices, and it really prevents stale credentials. So rotating things, rotating your current TGT is a really good practice that maybe not everybody looks at. Nick, were there any questions related to this slide, or is it okay for me to move on?
No, you're good to keep going. There's no questions on the slide at all yet.
Sweet. Okay. So what's the current state of Active Directory? We talked a little bit about how do you discover, are your accounts active or dormant? How do you differentiate? What metrics do you use to ensure that you know that it's something that should be there? How are they authenticating? So in Active Directory, it's NTLM or it's Kerberos. Do you know what everybody's using? Do you have an easy mechanism to say which is which and why it should be that? One example I often get related to the idea of Kerberos versus NTLM is the idea of when I installed my application, NTLM was the default, and I just installed whatever the default was. It's capable of using Kerberos, but it wasn't the path that was given to me when I ran the installer. And no one typically goes back to correct that. They just assume that that's what it needed, and that's a big issue in environments. But we'll talk a little bit about some tooling that can help you to do that. Are they being used as intended or misused? So that's the example of a service account logging on interactively, a human account being logged in or behaving like a service account, shared accounts doing things that they shouldn't be doing. How do you know when that happens, right? Are you just chasing logs? Do you see something somewhere in your environment that sets you off, or do you have a centralized location where you can figure that out? And then that goes into the idea of classification, right? So if you have an account that's logging on interactively and it shouldn't be, is it classified correctly? Do you know where all your service accounts are and what your service accounts are with Definity, right? Is it because someone said all service accounts go in this organizational unit, and so when you scan your environment for compliancy, you check that OU, and if it lives in that OU, it's a service account, check mark, right? Not check mark. Because we know over time, these things get put everywhere. They're being created ad hoc, most likely in your environment. And if they aren't today, that's awesome, but historically they probably were. And so you need to make sure that you can go back and ensure that they're classified correctly. So if it's going to be via OU, you should make sure that you have a way of validating that. And then there's the compliancy question, right? And so that comes down to really what your governance model is or where you are in your compliance journey. Typically, we see things like service accounts must have their credential rotated in X number of days, months, years, fill in the blank. Do they have an ownership? Do they have ownership, right? Is the owner current? Are there anything without owners? And this isn't just accounts, this is groups, right? When we think about security groups, ownership is really important. Who's going to make the decision that someone should or shouldn't be in a group if you need that, right? Who's going to make a decision as to whether that group is still being used or is still in use or needs to be used? Who's going to be able to talk to what that group has permissions to, right? For many environments, you're going to have groups that have access to highly classified data in some cases, right? And if you don't have an owner to talk to, how do you discover that without data management tools? And those are expensive and challenging to use. So an example would be if you have a file share. So let's say you have a storage platform and folks have been allowed to create and store data there over time, which is a great model. And then someone creates an Active Directory security group that has permissions to that resource. How do you collect that and know where that information is? How do you know what permissions it has to without having to do a really big discovery? And without ownership, it's a real big challenge. And then the privilege question. Are they really privileged? How do I know they're privileged? Is it just because they're domain admins? Is it just because it's account operators? Is it just because they are in the print operators group, or is it that someone created another admin and named it something completely different, but the permissions are equivalent or maybe just a little less than something that's full-blown access to your domain or worse, potential toxic combinations of permissions, and then how do we define against that? So just some of the numbers on this: 46% of service accounts regularly authenticate with NTLM, probably V1, V2 if you can. We'll talk about that in a little bit. 37% of on-prem service accounts are interactive, i.e. they're just logging on interactively to different resources, which creates a huge blast radius. And then 80% of organizations can't prevent the misuse of service accounts in real time. We're going to talk a little bit about how Silverfort can solve for that for you. Any questions?
There's a question that came in from Troy. Yeah. Got one from Troy. She was asking, what's the easiest way to disable a non-human identity AD account for interactive logins specifically? And then this is removed from domain users. What's your thought?
Yeah, I mean, there's a tag too, right? There's a checkbox that says allow to log in interactively, and you can just unselect that. It should be unselected by default, and that comes back to the idea of when we create service accounts, net new, how do we solve for these problems not happening again? And I really would strongly advise, if you don't have a standardized way of intaking service and shared accounts or non-human identities within your Active Directory, that you get one. Again, ITSM is a great way to start. Talk to your team, decide which attributes are important to you, decide how you're going to maintain ownership, decide what attributes, and then create policies around them, and just say, hey, like every service account must have its credential rotated in X number of days, if that's what your policy says. And all service accounts must have, they cannot log in interactively. And if they do, it's an exception, and then exceptions are handled in a different way. That would be my suggestion.
Excellent. No other questions so far.
Okay, sweet. This is kind of broad overview, but the cost of identity tech debt. This goes to the idea, the discovery gap side is like we're sending them out to the cloud and we don't even know what they do in Active Directory, and now they're going to inherit permissions on resources within that cloud environment. Or worse, into other areas like IDPs, and then we're worrying about the ownership side of it, right? So a service account or a shared account gets replicated out to something else, and now there's no owner. So people are seeing them in different environments, and we don't know who should action it, whether we need it at all. Is it going to break something? These are really challenging problems once you start spreading things out. The challenging things to manage within Active Directory, let alone now that they're replicated out to other areas. So standards related, like outdated protocols, NTLM. So we'll talk a little bit about how we're able to solve some of these things with Silverfort. But just being able to see that, what things are using NTLM, discover that, and then find out if they're capable of using Kerberos instead. And if they are stuck with NTLM, make sure it's V2, not V1. And if it is V1, then you're going to need to create some compensating controls to ensure that you can contain those things, right? We'll talk a little bit about how we'll be able to do that with Silverfort in some of the slides upcoming. And then I think this kind of dovetails off of that discovery gap, right? The idea of that now we're creating complex environments. It was bad enough in Active Directory. We had the sprawl and the issues that we discussed within that environment. And now someone has synchronized those accounts out to other IDPs or Entra or somewhere else. And they've widened the attack surface greatly. And our normal tools that we use in Active Directory, they may not be able to solve for that across a cloud or into an IDP. They may be only available to us for things that live in Active Directory. So some challenges there. So why do we have to act on these things? Outside the obvious, right? Like these are all bad things that we're talking about, right? You should be trying to act on as much as you can, but you also can't drink from the fire hose all the time, right? Like you kind of have to pick out what are the things that are important to us or critical in our environment, and then consume the elephant in smaller chunks, right? So, but some of the reasons why we're getting into problems here is like Windows 10 is going into support, so we're not going to get patches. There's going to be vulnerabilities. It's going to increase the exposure, and the blast radius is just going to grow exponentially with that, because it's going to be challenging for teams to get that out of the environment. And if you're in an environment where you're developing software and providing that to your customers, you may have to keep these things around, right? You may have to support for any number of years a legacy operating system in your environment, and if you're not keeping your house clean related to Active Directory and the accounts that could have access to those things, you're creating a much larger attack surface. Unmanaged identities drain resources and complicate security operations. Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? These are challenges. They're orphaned potentially. They don't have an owner. We don't know what they do. We don't know what they'll break. And somebody has to chase that down. And typically it's an IAM team. And I'm sure that most of the folks that are on the call are either in IAM or security, most likely. and you already have a lot to do, right? These are teams that are usually overtaxed and undermanned, and that creates all kinds of problems here when we're trying to chase down unmanaged identities or groups that don't have owners and things like that. So it's going to dovetail into the next one here too, which is compliancy, right? So you don't have ownership and you don't know what they do. How can you be compliant on those things? So you may have a governance driving force that could be regulation related. It could be just that your security organization says, well, now we need to make sure that all of these accounts follow this particular policy. Go do that. Or it could be worse. You end up having a security incident. And as part of your security incident, they recommend that every non-human identity in your environment has its credential rotated. And you know that's going to break stuff. And you don't know who the owners are, and you haven't kept that up to date, and it becomes kind of a whack-a-mole thing for the identity team. Or worse, you get an audit and you remediate the audit on, let's just say, October 1st of this year, and everybody high fives and says, great, we changed the passwords, and then 365 days from that, you're right back to square one because you didn't fix any of the tech debt. You just remediated the initial problem, which was rotating the credential. You didn't help the account owner to say, is there a better way of us doing this? So we talked a little bit about some of the other complementary controls like PAM. Could we have that thing vaulted? Could it automatically rotate in a PAM environment and therefore make it easier on those account owners rather than have to fall into the compliancy trap related to audit? And then cloud expansion just multiplies the risk. If you're replicating any of these accounts, and we talk about non-human accounts, but there are some human accounts that happen here too, right? So early on, we had the question of how do we do lifecycle for all different types of accounts. So if it's Steve Rennick, and Stephen Rennick has an administrative account and he has a test account and he has that in multiple domains, how do we make sure that those things get, from lifecycle perspective, are known and tied to the original account? This gets infinitely more difficult as you go into hybrid environments where you're not writing back to a centralized source, right? You have those accounts in your Active Directory and you've replicated them out, but now you're creating new ones because you need an account to do a certain thing in this IDP or in this this cloud. It becomes a real challenge.
There's a couple of questions came in, if I can interject,
yep.
Stephen.
You want to go back?
Yeah, I don't know which visual you need to have, but so let's see. This is Banyan is saying one of the biggest issues. This might be maybe more a statement than anything, but one of the biggest issues, especially with in-house crafted accounts or accounts created to replace default service accounts, is when the admin changes or leaves the job, changing the permissions and crashing systems or losing connections. It takes days and weeks to find all the locations where an account is used. We never do it, but documentation is the only solution. Configure, and it says configuration management, mentions NIST and some ISO IEC standards here. Mark says XP took forever to get rid of back in the day. And Banyan says Microsoft SQL is perhaps the worst offender and having accounts drop out for no reason. You go to the service and blank out the password fields, and then it resets itself when you click OK. So it says clock when you click OK, and it works. So I guess not so much questions. I saw them popping in here, but just you've got people's attention, and they're definitely vibing with you. I think you're on the same page.
Bang on, and I love that you mentioned documentation because it gets slept on all the time. Because we're all real good at that, right? Like we have time to do that. Like I mentioned, these teams that are taking care of these things and that end up falling on their shoulders to remediate, they're busy doing other things. They're operationalizing an IAM program or a security program in an organization that they're already overtaxed, and then we pile this on top of them, and then we say, make sure that you document everything that you've done. So when you replace a default service account with another service account, make sure that it's well known to everybody. Make sure that's documented in a centralized repository and that we can go back and reference that when we need to. Like, we love to think that it happens, but in most shops, it really doesn't, and especially not over time, right? It is an afterthought historically, and now I think we think of it because we have the pain of the tech debt, but it's probably still not being done, at least on a standardization basis. It's probably ad hoc. Certain administrators or teams are better with documentation than others. So it's a really, really good point.
Yep, that's all we got for now. Keep going.
Sweet. Okay, so how they exploit the gaps, right? Like these are real world risks from the legacy tech that we've been discussing. I think I touched base on it a little bit before, but outdated protocols and vulnerabilities that are still in use, right? So print nightmare is an easy one, anything using NTLM v1, right? These are things that maybe aren't easy to remediate based on the type of tech debt that you have, but things that should be obvious to you, and you need something to be able to call them out so that you can remediate those as soon as possible. Shadow accounts and stale credentials, again, what's dormant, what's active, how long has it been dormant or active, what metrics are you using to ensure that the status is correct, that it is dormant. And then there are exceptions to that. I want to call them out because it's something that people often don't think of. They just come up with a way of finding dormancy, but then what they realize is they disable the account and then they break something like once a year DR testing, right? So if you say, you know, the metric that we use for account dormancy is it hasn't had an interactive login in Active Directory in 3 months, we will disable that account. If it's the case of you know, a testing thing, or like I mentioned before, you're a company that has to support environments that are legacy, you may only test those things when needed, and you may only do a once a year or you know, a bi-yearly DR test on something. If those accounts are disabled, those processes are going to break. So you have to build something out that you know, really is robust and shows that, and then create an exception process for those particular instances. Moving on to privilege creep. Yeah, I mean, this is a no-brainer, right? If it has too much permission, the blast radius is huge, right? As soon as somebody gets to this account, even if they get to it initially, they can spawn new accounts potentially, they can move to new servers, they can create local accounts on those servers, they can move into file shares and deposit things, they can change all kinds of stuff. So making sure that you follow the notion of least privilege wherever you can in your environment is obviously best practice. And I would say everybody needs a starting point, right? It's not going to be easy for you to say, this year we're going to do all this stuff. It's probably best to start net new. So make sure that you have standardized processes that are repeatable for creating new accounts and address your tech debt that way. So if for example, security groups are a problem, we'll make sure that not anyone can create a security group, that if someone's creating a security group, it must have a proper description, it must have an owner, it must have, you know, whatever attributes that you deem are critical or required, that they can't be created without them. And you'll start to peter off that tech debt instead of recreating it all the time. The same thing would fall into the idea of service or shared accounts in Active Directory. Anything that's ad hoc, you're playing whack-a-mole with, because you'll go back and remediate the tech debt and then create it net new, and then the cycle just continues and continues and continues. Bad practice, right? So start with net new, solve for those things, and then go back retroactively and try to remediate the really painful things that are going to take you a lot of time. And that would be my recommendation for attacking it. Unless, of course, you have something that's blatantly obvious, right? You've been called out, something's been exposed, something's been already misused, and it's been called out, then address them immediately. But starting with the net new and then working your way back is not a bad way of doing things too. The last one is misaligned authentication. Yeah, I mean, these trust relationships in Active Directory can be challenges. I think there's also a misalignment of authentication too, related to the idea of what I talked about before. I started with NTLM and I didn't bother to go to Kerberos, right? Kerberos, while it's not the strongest level of authentication that we can have in any environment, is pretty good for Active Directory. Much better than any version of NTLM, but certainly try to remove every version of NTLM v1 that you have, and if you must have it, make sure that it's v2. Any questions on this? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we've done. It's going to incorporate a lot of what we've talked about already, but kind of I'll break it down into some functional silos really. So the goal that I had with Silverfort specifically was initially to put MFA everywhere, right? So we had a mandate that said if MFA isn't supported natively within the application, i.e. it doesn't support SAML or modern authentication protocols, then we must have something that allows us to put MFA in front of that. And Silverfort gave us that from day one. If something authenticates within Active Directory, you can challenge MFA against it. And so I know that that Dora is going to talk a little bit about some of those controls and give you a bit of a demo on things, but that was the initial use case that we had. And it kind of blew up from there, and protecting service accounts that we couldn't protect before. And by protect, I mean, you know, some controls around those, some actual runtime, real-time controls. It also helped us to give visibility into highly privileged accounts that weren't obvious, right? So we talked about that earlier. What are the shadow admins? What are the things that are highly permissioned that aren't named domain admins or account operators or print operators? And then we also wanted to reduce or eliminate NTLM wherever we could in our environment, and also use that as a mechanism for some other remediation longer term related to applications that were potentially installed with that. So what do we get out of Silverfort? Well, we get visibility, right? So we can see every authentication for every account and resource, NTLM, LDAP, or Kerberos within our Active Directory environment. So if it logs in and it is joined to Active Directory, we get to see that authentication at real time. And we can also, it helps us to classify those accounts. So shared accounts, service accounts, admin accounts, and also helps us with dormancy, right? We can use that as a metric because it's seeing every authentication. Is very good and very easy for us to go in and see what has logged in or has not logged in. I would not recommend you use that entirely as the only metric that you have. You may have some accounts, like I mentioned before, that are tied to applications that may seem dormant, but at least for the majority of applications, you can use this to try and figure out which ones fall into those categories. It also helps you with potential account misuse, right? So we wanted the visibility of, do I have administrators who have accounts that are logging in like service accounts, right? Where they put something in a script or they're installing something with their own account or whatever, and then address those with those people. And maybe they don't even realize what you may find in your environment when you start using tools like this is people didn't know they were doing a bad thing. They just knew it was a thing that was easy. It's kind of like that analogy that I talked about earlier, right? Build a gate and make it difficult to get through the gate. People will figure out ways of going around the gate. And that's just, you know, an example of what you might have that will show up as account misuse, and you can address it and have them do the right thing at that point. And then it'll also allow you to see all the privileged accounts that you have and how active they are and what they're doing. And, you know, eventually, as we'll get to in the far right side of the slide, take some action against those and see what's anomalous behavior potentially. The second part is the remediation side. So when we find things that don't have ownerships, we're able within Silverfort and other mechanisms, we tie it back to the actual AD side, but we're able to report on that. So if we see something where an owner's become disabled or that there isn't an owner assigned, we can flag it, and then we have a compliance team that works to address those things. It really helps you to remediate the biggest tech debt issues that we're talking about. And a lot of those are related to potentially audits, right? So you have to change a password once every year. Well, what are the accounts that didn't? Or you have accounts that have password never expires, and they haven't expired, and it's been around for 10 years or whatever. And it's, or you have to have passwords, you implement a new policy that says passwords must be X number of characters long. All of these things would be visible to you, and you'd be able to help remediate those things in your environment. And Silverfort gives you a lot of really valuable information here, right? So let's take the example of a service account where we can't find an owner and no one wants to do anything with it because it is potentially going to break the business. The visibility that you would get within Silverfort to be able to provide back to someone is you have a lot of forensic data. What I mean by that is if you take your service account and you look through every AD authentication, which Silverfort allows you to do, you can see where it's authenticating to and from. And are those things, do they happen on a normal basis or are they ad hoc, right? So if you can see that it's only logging into these 4 or 5 machines, have an administrator go in and log into those machines and see who owns the machines. And then you can potentially drive down and figure out who the owner of the account should be by looking at where it logs in. So that's a use case that you could do it for. Second part to that is when it comes to the password change, it's really difficult to do that, and it's scary for a lot of teams. But if you can come back to them with relevant information that says, I know that your service account is only logging in to these machines, this source, this destination, those are the places that you're going to need to change that account. You can give them the information that they probably don't have and make it much easier for them. And then the last point in the remediate side is to modernize the authentications. This kind of goes back to this idea of application A came into the company. When we installed it, the administrator, the defaults were NTLM, and now it supports Kerberos, or it didn't support Kerberos back then, and now it does. You can actually go back to those and say your application is logging in with a legacy protocol and put the onus on the application owner. Can you tell me or reach out to the support team of that application and let us know if it supports NTLM? And if it doesn't, that's kind of okay too. You can create an exception, and then you can take action to do things that will help secure those authentications, even if they're NTLM v2. Hopefully there's no v1, but even if it's v1, in the next protect area, we're going to talk about those compensating controls that you can leverage in Silverfort to really help minimize and shrink the attack surface of that. So the biggest thing I would say related to non-human identities within this ecosystem is your ability to take action on them. And what I mean by action is I mean real action, real runtime action, not something where I saw something in a log and something did a bad thing and now I want to go back and remediate it. I mean, you can create a virtual fence around something. So if you have predictable login for a service account, like we talked in the remediate side, and they're scared to change the password because they're afraid it's going to break, and so they get an exception that says we need 6 more months to be able to figure out what's going on so we don't break the business. But through Silverfort, you can see that that account only logged into these 5 sources, and from these 5 sources to these 5 destinations, or vice versa. You can create a virtual fence within Silverfort to be able to say only allow this account to log into these accounts, to log into these resources, and lock it down in that sense. Or if you're not comfortable with taking the actual deny login action, you can create a notification that says someone is trying to log in to this machine, or via this policy to a different resource. It shouldn't be logging in there, and you can investigate, right? So if you're not comfortable with the deny action, you can also do a notify action. And this really helps to prevent them from being used maliciously, especially in the cases where you can't remediate the tech debt immediately and you have to do something like a compensating control. Now, I would also recommend doing this for anything that you see with predictable login. Right, it just helps to decrease the attack surface and the blast radius for all of these types of accounts. So think of it from a shared account perspective. Not a big fan of shared accounts. I think there are probably better ways of doing things, but realistically, in environments that have R&D and contract manufacturing environments, it's a very real possibility that someone's going to request a shared account because they need to keep a session going on a Windows machine for extra long, or it has to go between 2 shifts or something like that. So if they create that account and you restrict it to only being able to log into 4 or 5 machines, you do lose the visibility that you would typically have with individual accounts, right? So from an auditability perspective, it's still problematic, but you are shrinking the attack surface by saying this shared account can only log into these machines. And if it tries to log in anywhere else, deny that log on. So those are the things that you can do proactively by creating policies that have these denies for predictable login, or by design. If you're saying, like, I'm requesting this service account, and as part of your now automated process for that, you can request that from the person that's asking. Say, where is it going to log in? Where does it need to be? And then you can start with an already constrained point, saying it can only log in here. And if we notice that there's issues, or that it's trying to log in other places, now you have valuable data to be able to go back to that team and say, we can see it trying to go here. Is it intentional? And if it is, then we append the policy to make sure that it can get to the things that it needs to. So that actionability, we'll kind of correlate it to identity threat detection and response. That's an acronym, ITDR, that we hear a lot from a lot of different companies. And what I will tell you is, from my experience, Silverfort does this from an Active Directory perspective better than anyone else, right? Because actually the R in ITDR is an actual response. It's a remediation, it's an action. It's not creating a ticket for someone to do something, although that is a capability that you would have. But this idea that you could virtual fence something or deny a login based on the policy that you've created allows you to shrink your attack surface significantly and actually take real action on something versus just create a ticket and have someone look at it at some point. So further to that point, in an ITDR perspective, you can detect and block or just notify on anomalous or risky behavior, right? So over time, having visibility into every Active Directory authentication that happens for every account, you're going to see patterns emerge, right? And when something anomalous happens in that, you can create policies that say, I want to challenge MFA against that because that human account doesn't normally do that thing. And you can do that in line via policy. You can also just flat out block, right? And there are some controls, and maybe if he has time, Dor will go over those. But you can really action those things based on what you're seeing real time in your environment and just stop it in its tracks, which is a beautiful thing. It'll also give you information about suspected brute force attacks, right? So if someone's brute forcing a password or whatever, it's flagged immediately. There's a really great eye candy dashboard that hopefully you'll get to see in Silverfort. But there are also integrations that you'll have into your SIEM. So if you're a Splunk shop or a separate security environment, you can create an external dashboard in their SIEM that can show them these things that are happening at real time and allow them either to help ask you to help adjust policies and create new policies, or to investigate those things leveraging the tool. And then the last one in terms of protection is just that, right? If you have NTLM v1, you can just deny the logins. You can say no longer allow NTLM v1, it must be at least v2, or you can create some compensated controls around that if it must be used and create the virtual fence around those things. So a lot here usually generates some questions, so I'll shut up for a minute and see if there are any.
A couple came in, and then Dor obviously needs a couple minutes to do his bit as well. Banyan says it's Silverfort compatible with Samba for Linux. Says I'm contemplating using a Proxmox VM system to service Linux clients where the MFA is done in Linux itself. And then it opens Docker for Windows 11 on the clients. You can tell it's very technical. I love this.
Yeah.
And the end user doesn't know they're living in a Linux box. So I'll kind of stop there.
Yeah, if it's authenticating back to Active Directory, one of the things that I've typically seen in my environment, I don't want to speak on behalf of Silverfort, so I think that's a question that we may need the Silverfort folks to take it back. But in my experience, if the underlying system is authenticating to Active Directory directly from that client system, you should be able to protect it. If it's relaying it through a proxy, that becomes a challenge, right? Because from an Active Directory perspective, you're only seeing what's coming from the proxy and you lose the visibility that's what's happening on the other side of that. So probably not a question I can answer without understanding it a little bit better and maybe a takeaway for the Silverfort team.
Yeah, it was a little complex there, but
no,
anyway,
it's great.
So,
it's great.
Yeah, it's great. Good question here. Banyan does say Silverfort is brilliant, so I think he's already a big fan anyways. David's making a comment earlier on about 3-4 minutes ago. That you should create a practice to disable and delete service accounts when an app is decommissioned and revoke certificates which were used. And obviously,
I love this. Yeah, I spoke a little bit about this at a conference I was at recently where I said, realistically, we need to stop looking or only looking at lifecycle as it's tied to a human and start tying it to applications, start tying it to containerization, start tying it to those things. It's a challenging thing to do and it's a little bit forward thinking, but he's nailed it on the head, right? If you can do that when the application goes end of life or sunsets, all those accounts and things that are tied to it will go with it. And it's brilliant for long-term tech debt. And it's moving the life cycle away from humans and moving it more into the idea of I can tie it to an application container, et cetera, fill in the blank. I love that one. It's perfect.
Very good. Then let's hand the reins over to Dor. Dor, I think we got about 11 minutes left in today's webinar. And we'll go ahead and make you presenter. I'll let you know when we can see your screen. And then you can show how Silverfort's can help apply to the things that we talked about.
Okay.
I can see your screen. I think you're good to go.
Great. So before I will present myself, I will just answer the previous question. As long as the application is connected to the Active Directory domain controller and the domain itself, then in Kerberos, it must be part of the domain. And if the client is outside the domain, then it will use NTLM to authenticate, and we can protect both of these protocols. So with that, my name is Dor, and I practice security research for over a decade, and I specialize in authentication protocols. I am an RSA 2024 speaker, and recently I published a not logon vulnerability, which is a null dereference that leads to a domain controller crash. And today we'll talk about NTLM. So it is a real pain for enterprise and a hot topic these days. And why? Because Windows 10 is becoming its end of life. And one of the features that is being deprecated is NTLM. And they start the process with the removal of NTLM version 1. And now, for the next 10 minutes, we will talk about how to detect and eliminate NTLM from your environment using Silverfort. Just a little bit of how NTLM works. So NTLM was introduced in '93, so it's really, really old. And it's a challenge response authentication mechanism, and it allows a client to prove its identity without sending its credentials directly. And in Active Directory, the server validates the response, the NTLM response, using the domain controller. So because it does not know the client's credentials. So we won't go over the entire flow, but what you need to know is that the client is responsible to compute the NTLM response using the user's credentials, the user's password. And the server will take this and will tell the client which NTLM version to use, 1 or 2. Any questions about this slide?
Not on. Well, there's one. Charlie says, how accurate is the NTLM detection? And he gives an example here. I created an audit for monitoring NTLM, and after not seeing any attempted connections, disabled NTLM, had many issues with services users unable to connect, and therefore had to re-enable NTLM.
So what do you mean by disabling NTLM? It means disabling it using the group policy, or disabling it in Silverfort?
I don't have any more detail, but I'm assuming disabling support for the protocol period is what it.
Okay, so disabling the protocol itself will break a lot of things, but the detection is completely accurate. Like, we know to detect NTLM, and we know how to detect it's both versions with a high precision using Silverfort. So just some key. Okay. So key security differences between version 1 and version 2. The first one is the encryption. NTLM version 1 uses a weak desencryption, which is a 56-bit key, which is really easy to detect the plain text credential and use it by many methods such as rainbow table, and NTLM version 2 uses a stronger HMAC MD5 one-way function method. Another key is the replay protection and relay. NTLM version 2 introduces AV pair data such as timestamp and target info, as you can see in the picture on the right, preventing replay attacks and relay attacks, which protects basically the source and destination that is the both generating to and from. And lastly, the hash exposure. NTLM version 1 response calculation does not include a client challenge or target info fields, making it easier to recover or use the 56 NT hasher desk key. Any questions?
No, I'll interject if a question comes in. You can just keep going.
Oh, okay, no problem. So lastly, I will demonstrate how to investigate an authentication fallback. So what is an authentication fallback? The most modern authentication protocol in Active Directory is Kerberos. All developers are required to use Negotiate SSP, a security support provider package, instead of the NTLM authentication package. What does that mean? It means that Negotiate means Kerberos first, and if Kerberos does not work for any reason, NTLM will follow. So how do we know that? Because what it means that in order to make the authentication process transparent, it won't tell the end user that Kerberos has failed. It will just work. So how will we know how to detect it? I will show you right now. So as you can see, this is my solo Fort page, and in my lab, my Salford lab has many authentication, and we're currently looking at the authentication logs. So as you can see here in my private environment, I would like to reach misconfigured file share. And if I will reach this file share, it will work. You will see nothing is wrong. However, if I will go back to my Silverfort and I will refresh, you will see in a few seconds let's see if it works, that Kerberos was denied. You can see that my user has authenticated from my source client to my destination server. It tried to use it tried to approach CIFS, which is a service principal name for file share, and it was denied because of bad server, because the service principal name was not configured properly for this application. However, in the same second, you can see that an NTLM authentication was successful. So how we're gonna find all the denied Kerberos authentication? I will go to protocol. I will filter Kerberos, and then I will go and filter my authentication log on the IDP result to denied. And this is just for today, but you can change the date range to all, or you can choose the date range of that you wish. And you can see that I can see all my denied authentications, and we can go over the reasons. Actually, I have a lot of bad Kerberos authentications, but we can see for the following example that my denied authentication, and the reason that the server was simply not configured properly. So if I will go and I will reset my filters, and I will search this specific destination server, then I can see that every time I try to authenticate using Kerberos, and NTLM is followed. You can see it here, and you can see it here, and you can see it every time I try to reach this specific this specific server. So I can do multiple things. For instance, I can protect this server using MFA, and I can create this policy. And I can press save. However, it won't prevent the NTLM on the network. But what I can do is understand why the application itself is not configured properly. So I can actually go to the domain controller itself and understand why the computer was not configured properly. And in this example, I can see that there are no service principal names for this computer. And if I will add the correct service principal name, then it will start working again. Any questions about this demo?
None so far.
Okay, so what you need to do in order to eliminate NTLM in your environment is create a list in using Silverford of all the NTLM servers that they are equivalent to applications that exist in your Active Directory, and then create a list that will prioritize first NTLM version 1 and followed by NTLM version 2, and plan how to find all the reasons why NTLM is being authenticated, and either fix, upgrade, or decommission these specific servers or applications. So yeah, that's it. If you have any questions or you want to read the in-depth of the full NTLM elimination guide, you can scan the QR code.
Excellent. We've got just a couple of questions that did come in.
Okay.
Horatio says, this goes back, or David says, how can we mitigate the risks regarding Linux servers, some of them non-compatible with Kerberos? Do you have any play there?
So actually Linux, I've seen many operating systems that are actually are compatible with Kerberos and are even more protected, because the latest versions of Linux, such like distributions, have Kerberos fast implemented in them, which is additional protection for the Kerberos authentication itself. So I would look for upgrading the Linux distribution to its latest version and try to look at the documentation and see if it does support. But I really suggest getting rid of all unsupported clients, because NTLM is a great risk for your environment.
This may be more of like a product question, because Banyan, I think, said that noted that your product rocks. So I think Banyan already has it. But can we get the source data to show up on the CISA LME, the Logging Made Easy dashboard?
So yeah, the Silverford ISPN does show the NTLM version 1 servers, and you can actually I have created the Kerberos denied by IDP filters, and you can see I can actually export and group by the destination and see, and I'll have a full report of all the servers that have failed for whatever reason. The Kerberos authentications. as you can see here. Maybe I can.
Yeah, perfect. No, that's good. Any zoom in might will help with it. Yeah.
Yes.
Hopefully that
actually the
answers,
investigation tools are very helpful for it.
All right, cool. So I think we're at the end of our time. We're definitely a couple minutes over, but I do appreciate most of you staying on nonetheless. Lots of good detail in here on both presentations. Dor, Stephen, thank you very much for your presentations today. And we do want to thank the folks at Silverfort for sponsoring today's Real Training for Free. Again, thank you all for your questions and your comments and your interactions with us. That always what makes this thing really kind of very personal. And we get to make sure that we're meeting your needs educationally. Thanks a lot for attending today. This is going to conclude today's webcast. We'll catch you all on the next one. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me. Yep.